My name's Carioli. I'm currently the editor-in-chief of Boston Magazine. Before that, for about 20 years, I was being editor-in-chief at the Boston Phoenix, which was the premier alternative weekly newspaper in Boston for about 40 years. We also owned the best alternative radio station in Boston history, WFNX. I started my career as a rock critic and then sort of moved up and eventually became the editor of the newspaper. Well, Boston's changed so much musically in the past 20 years, and I think if you talk to people who've been here for a long time, they'll tell you that there's such a distinctive Boston scene and the stuff that happened here. It had a huge history starting in the, as far back as the early 80s in punk rock. By the time I got here in about 1990, there was a huge underground music scene that was sort of the epicenter for a national underground music scene. When Michael Azerrad wrote his book, Our Band Could Be Your Life, Mission of Burma was part of that, but so were so many other bands that some of which are still around, some of which aren't. At that time, it was bands like, still Gangrene and Slapshot and Hardcore, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones, who were breaking out of that. A few years later, it was bands like Dropkick Murphys, who you could see around the corner at the Rat, and just getting their start at Sunday all ages afternoon hardcore shows. And you also had, Boston was a huge music market for national touring bands. So you could see bands, everyone from Black Flag and the Misfits to up through the grunge era. You'd see bands like Screaming Trees and Alice in Chains in really small places like the Channel and the Rat and the Paradise. So a lot of those bands all got their start here, partly because there's this young, constantly repopulated college audience that's always coming to town and then always coming back. Yeah, I mean, my favorite era in some ways was that early '90s Boston, where you had a bunch of bands who were just beginning to break out. It was bands like the Lemonheads, who'd been around for a while and were starting to have some major label success. You had bands like Bullet Revolta, who are a fantastic, punk metal band who were signed to RCA, and we all thought were going to be, the next Soundgarden. You had bands like Seika and Strip Mind, who were doing this really sort of heavy metal stuff, and we're getting major label deals. Even a little bit later into the even into the early 2000s, with bands like The Explosion and Cave In, there was this really sort of span of about 10 to 15 years of really great, heavy, loud music that wasn't dumb. It was smarter. In some ways, it was more, it was artier. It was more literate. And it had a flavor that you wouldn't find. You weren't going to find it in LA, which was a little bit too glitzy. It wasn't New York, which is a little bit too dark. It had its own sort of its own feel. It never quite coalesced into like a Seattle scene that was just rated by the major labels. And in some ways that was good in the sense that it wasn't ruined. And in some ways it was more difficult because those bands never became the success that they were everywhere else. But at least here, we all thought of them as ours, and they were supported, in ways that you wouldn't find in other cities. Boston has become not only a hotbed of musical talent, but of musical technology. You look at startups like the Echo Nest over in Somerville, who were acquired by Twitter. Their business is what they call it musical intelligence. They're learning everything they can about what's being written about music, about how it's being streamed, and how to sort of predict what your next favorite band is going to be. I think that comes out of an interesting confluence of people who've always been in Boston. You have MIT and Harvard, with these extraordinarily smart, sort of technically minded people who are also really big fans of music and big fans of art. And are trying to figure out innovative ways of pulling those two things together. You have people trying to solve problems about how bands are going to make money in the future and how bands are going to market themselves directly to their fans. So in some ways, and a lot of the people who are behind those companies got their start either in bands or listening to the bands that we listen to, and found their passion for music here, and then stuck around and tried to find new solutions. And I think that's going to be one of Boston's ongoing legacies, is that not only was it a place that people were super passionate about music, but they were inspired to try and find new solutions for how that music's going to survive going forward.